So now we create a property binding. For that, we create a component. Okay, now create the component in GGC, and component name is property binding. We create the component, and first we have to map that component in your app component. So just copy that selector name and come to your app component file and just map that component. Okay. Okay. Comes to your view file. You can just check out your property binding is works. Output is this property binding. That component is rendered. Now, when we use a property binding, okay, if you want bind a dynamic data property, a dynamic data property to any HTML attribute or directive or custom attribute. Okay? For that, we use a property binding. Means you have to bind a dynamic data property on HTML attribute, not HTML tag. I mentioned there HTML attribute. Tag and attribute is a difference. To any HTML attribute, to any directive, or any custom attribute. Then you go for the property binding. Property binding is always apply on your attribute or a directive or your custom attribute. Okay, the syntax of that property binding is square bracket. The square bracket indicates property binding. Inside that, you can mention your HTML attribute name, or you can mention in square bracket directive as well. Further, we learn the directive as well. Also, you can bind custom attribute. If you create your custom attribute, you can bind your custom attribute as well. How we can create that? We can move. We can learn further. So don't worry about that. Equal to, you can choose or you can bind your property name. Property name. Okay. In that way, you can use a property bind. Okay. Clear? How you can use it? Just check out here. Simple. I'm using s2 type. Apply property binding. Okay. In that, we can bind a property HTML attribute. Okay. So instead of that, I just use input tag. That is better understanding for your purpose. So I'm using an input tag, or in input tag, we use a value attribute. Value is a HTML attribute. Is that way, an HTML attribute, we can make it property binding. It's use a square bracket and bind on one property, that is a name. That name property we have to create in your component file. So first we create that name property in our component file. So here we can create that property name, sorry, whose type is string, and initially I can set the data. We can render you our good name Sumit around the date. Okay, now that property we can bind that value attribute, and data will be displayed dynamically. If you see, Sumit Raupande is displayed on that input box. Okay. If you want to apply this property binding to the image. Is it possible to apply property binding for image? Yes, you can. But remember these things. Property binding is used HTML attribute. Whatever the HTML attribute there present, you can use. Otherwise, you can bind the directive. Okay. You can also use property binding for directive. Also use for the custom attribute. So here I'm using a break tag and just apply image. I use the image to render the image using property binding. So instead of SRC, here we use SRC attribute, we can bind property bind SRC and make your property name to bind the property name. So here we create one more property img URL whose type is a string and mention the path basically. So current directory again goes to asset folder and goes pg.jpeg. Extension is mandatory, is required. Okay, then that img URL you have to bind that SRC. Okay, just check out the image will be displayed or not. So see your image is displayed. If you want to image set the image height and width, you can set it using CSS. So here I can apply the CSS using class. Just for your sake of understanding purpose, I'm using here apply the CSS through the class. So here one more attribute is there, class attribute, that is the HTML attribute. I'm here mention the my img. Okay, that is a class name. My img is a class name. That my img class name we have to create in our CSS file. So come to the CSS file of that component and create a class. In CSS class creation, we use a dot operator. We called it as a selector. In CSS, it is called a selector. Okay. For any class you have to create in CSS, use a dot operator. After that, create a class name. That is a my img curly bracket. In technical language way, we call it as a selector. And mention here width of that image. If you want to require 250 pixel, and then use it is a 250 pixel. Okay. The image will be properly set for your width and height. Okay. Get these things, everybody. We can apply CSS from the class. Previously, we apply the CSS using HTML tag. Right now, I am applying CSS using CSS class. That for we create a custom CSS class. Okay, everybody's get this how property binding is work